Before I get much into Book 4, I did want to mention one aspect of Arnhardt's argument in his chapter on Plato that was particularly interesting to me, and that is where he discusses the work of the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. And he does that to kind of relate what Plato is talking about to contemporary discipline, in this case psychology. He does that a lot. And he says that Kohlberg's findings in developmental psychology are somewhat controversial. His theory is that we have three levels of human consciousness, so to speak, three levels that human beings go through or can go through in their development, okay? Their intellectual and their psychological development. The first is pre-conventional, okay? And basically that's as childhood, where we don't understand even all the rules and where somebody has to watch us and regulate us, okay? And then at a certain point, he places it at 9. A lot of religions place it at about 12, okay? There comes a point where children can be expected to understand the rules and basically know through the rules what right and wrong are and be responsible for their actions. Okay? And he calls that the conventional level. And that term should be familiar to you because in this class as well as the intro class, we've talked about the difference between nature and convention, right? And conventional means what is man-made. So this just means that the child understands the rules that are laid down by the teacher, by his parents, by society, and is able to follow them and therefore knows when he's doing wrong, okay? But only through the rules. The third level is the principled level. And this is where you know not just because there's rules, and actually you may be able to understand that some rules are not right, okay? You understand on a higher level right from wrong because you've used your own reasoning, okay? And so he says, and this is the controversial part of this theory, I guess, is that he says that most people do not achieve the third level. Most people stay at the level of the conventional, okay? They don't reason about right and wrong. They are not capable of really judging the rules independently. So they stay at that level of just sort of obeying the rules, okay? Whereas some people move on to the principled level in which they are thinking independently. They're able to actually critique the rules. And this is what's required for the natural right and natural law way of thinking that our founders employed when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So, can you see why that's a little bit controversial? Do you get his point there? It's controversial because he's saying that the majority of people can't achieve that highest level, and therefore are just rule followers at best, okay? And therefore, see what implications that has for the type of government that we have. Can you see that? Okay, because if we are a democracy, people are basically responsible for their government, but if most of them are not able to think at that higher principled level, then they aren't very good at making independent judgments about what their government does, how their lawmakers legislate, and so forth. They don't have that capability. And that calls into question the quality of democracy, the outcomes of democracy. As it says there, Kohlberg says that people prefer to reason at the highest level they can, so he's saying that most people are incapable by aptitude to do so. If this is so, then at the level of the city, to get government influenced by principles, you'd have to have those who have achieved the third level in charge, okay? And that would support Plato's model of, having the wise rule. So the question is this right? What do you all think? I mean, do you think Kohlberg and Plato were basically on the same page? Are they right about this? Can most people not think at this principled level and be able to independently judge the laws and actions of their government? You're not so sure? You're in trouble with this?
A little bit, not a lot, because I kind of see what he's saying, just from observing the world a little bit. Not everybody always thinks things through. Just kind of go for the quickest, instant gratification type thing. But I kind of see what he's saying.
It's troubling. I think, what you kind of look like you're bothered by it. You may see his point, but it's bothersome. Yeah.
Well, you would agree with, like they're talking with setting up the city, having all these rules and regulations to influence the people to go have a certain moral identity, and really trust them to do the right things.
Yep, it reflects Plato's worldview too. He thinks that a minority of people can think at that higher level, but the majority cannot, and they need to be regulated. They need to be regulated by people who know what they're doing and not left to their own devices. So it very much reflects Plato's view of the world. Okay? Now he does understand that for the most part the world doesn't work that way, and in fact in his own city the people rule. But it's problematic because then that, in his mind, puts the unqualified in charge. Okay? And so you never know what the outcome is going to be or how good the citizens are going to be. So now, there's a question also as to what produces this. If this is the case, if only the minority of people can independently think about and judge issues like right and wrong and whether the laws are good or not, then is that caused by nature? In other words, is it just by genetics or nature that somehow this is distributed across the population unevenly? Or is it a matter of education, inadequate education? Could more people be able to be good citizens and think this way if they were properly educated to do so? So that's an open question, isn't it? Because we really don't know the answer to that. We certainly could say that people don't receive enough of a citizen education in our society. I mean, that seems pretty clear to me just from watching what happens as we go through school. There's not a lot of emphasis on that, or there could always be more emphasis on that.
I was also wondering for the third part of the principle, I think you said that he said that they have the ability to reason, more so. But that doesn't necessarily mean to be great rulers. They could reason themselves to great power. I don't know, what kind of reason are we talking about? Reason to look out for everyone equally, or reason to get themselves everything they want. I don't know if that necessarily means they're able to be great rulers.
Well, I think that but Kohlberg and Plato both are thinking moral reason. When Kohlberg uses the term principle, he's talking about the exact ability to be able to think beyond your own individual interests. Because a person can use reason, as you point out, to do all kinds of things. They can be quite smart and pursue their own self-interest, or they can go into a field that's very complex and be very smart and do a good job, but still not have the ability to reason morally in an abstract way that would give them the ability to see beyond their own self-interest. So that, I think he is talking about more than just any old reasoning. It's the kind of reasoning that puts you into another person's position. You step out of your own shoes and into other people's shoes, and you can think about what would be best for all, not just for yourself. So it's a level of abstraction in moral reasoning, right? That he thinks is difficult for people. But what I'm saying is perhaps it's a matter of not training people to think that way. Not enough, anyway. I'm not saying that everybody could think this way, but I wonder if more people could think this way if they were encouraged and trained to do so better than they are. Civic education and moral education are very problematic in our society because they're tied up with so-called competing values. And so we tend to kind of shy away from and schools do tend to shy away from dealing with those in great detail. Like for instance, in my son's junior high, middle school, they had a character counts program. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. But it didn't really reach in depth into anything that they did. It was sort of, posters. I mean, my perception of it anyway, posters on the wall. Maybe everybody got an award for some character trait too. I remember that. Every single kid got some sort of award for having a character trait, which I don't think was terribly helpful. But I sat there thinking, I wish that somehow they could go into more depth about these character traits and why it is that they're so important. And families vary. They differ from family to family as to how much they emphasize these things and how they teach them and what they teach them. So we don't have a society where we have any sort of unity when it comes to moral principles or even political principles. So it's troubling, but I wonder if we couldn't do a better job. So we'll leave it at that. But Arnhart, this is Arnhart, he says, the Declaration of Independence is built on this idea of the laws of nature. It's a very abstract concept. It's a very philosophic, you might say, concept that you wonder, do people really understand the reasoning that goes into that? And if they don't, are they able to step outside of themselves and think about the common good? Okay, any other comments or questions about that whole thing? Part of the reason why I raised it is because, and you remember from the video, Plato is often accused of being an elitist. And there's a good reason for that, because he really kind of was. He was an elitist of the intellect. In other words, he wasn't an elitist of money. He didn't say, well, the rich should rule. But he does say the smarter, the more philosophically informed should rule. They're the more qualified. And in a democracy, that's a highly controversial statement. In fact, it's an unacceptable statement because democracy is simply not built around that concept. All right, so let's get into Book 4 a little bit. In Book 4, we find that right away Adeimantus questions this picture that Socrates has developed about how the warrior class will live, the auxiliaries. Okay? Because he said that they will have everything in common, okay? And they will share, in other words, everything, and they will dedicate their whole lives to the city. They really won't have their own private lives. They're going to live really in a Spartan kind of way, by which I mean no luxuries to speak of, they're going to be training all the time. They're dedicated to the city, okay? And Adeimantus's problem with that is he doesn't understand what's in it for them. Why would anybody want to do that? Okay? Because it seems to him that the bronze class, the majority of people who are just working people, would have it much better because they could make all the money that their enterprise could lead them to. They could have the luxuries that these people who are supposedly higher up can't have. And they have the freedom to be able to entertain themselves however they want. The warriors, they are very restricted, like we talked about last week. They're censored. Okay? So why wouldn't you want to be a member of the working class? It sounds like a better deal. Okay? So that's the question that he asks. Why wouldn't you want to have to him it's natural. People want to have things. They want to have their own family. And truly, Socrates is proposing something, and he'll go into this further in Book 5, something very unnatural. Okay? It's very artificial and engineered. He does not want to recognize the family ties that you pretty much see in just about every society. So Adeimantus's objection is a reasonable one. Okay? He's thinking, how's this going to work? Who will do it? Who's going to take this deal? maybe just out of prestige, that only keeps you happy for so long. Now, Socrates' answer to this, I say, is disturbing because he doesn't directly address the question, okay? He doesn't say, oh, you'd be happy if you were a warrior because people would look up to you, or you would find that your activities were more satisfying than the shoe cobbler or whatever. He doesn't give a concrete answer like that. Instead, he almost acknowledges that Adeimantus is right in a way, okay? That they would not be as happy as they might be when he says that it's the happiness of the overall city that he's interested in, not the happiness of any individual. Okay, so let's take a look at that. It's on page 95, if you have your book. In 420B through C, approximately, if you've got a different page number to book 4. So he says, we thought that we'd find justice most easily in such a city, and injustice, by contrast, in the one that is governed worst, and that by observing both cities, we'd be able to judge the question we've been inquiring into so far. We take ourselves then to be fashioning the happy city, not picking out a few happy people and putting them in it, but making the whole city happy, okay? And we'll look at the opposite city soon, all right? So is that not like saying it doesn't matter if the warriors are completely satisfied? I'm looking at the city as a whole, okay? What do you think he means by that exactly? Well, how would you know if a city was happy as opposed to the people in it that make up the different groups? Does it make any sense? I mean, we have in Manhattan, we have this, I can't stand this phrase, but some people call it man-happiness. I can't stand that. I don't know why exactly. I was like, it's not man-happiness, damn it. Don't edit that out. It's just a town, like any other town, but we try to rev it up and make Manhattan into a really spectacular place, and that's one of the ways we do it. We call it the Little Apple. So, but does it really make any logical sense to say Manhattan is happy?
Maybe he was trying to go for one of those, the sum of the parts equals the overall whole. Like if you can have enough happiness in little pockets, maybe it makes the whole city happy.
So maybe he's saying that there's a certain number of people that have to be happy in every class?
Yeah, 50% plus one or something.
Okay,
Maybe
the
that's what
majority? Yeah. Well, I mean, if we were going to try to operationalize it, we'd have to do something like that, right? We'd have to say, how are we going to measure happiness? Well, it has to be at least the majority or something like that. Or if the city's going to be happy, let's make it 2/3, Yeah.
Maybe he's going for like the identity is in the group or something, like you're not, like you don't really matter your individual life, but like everyone together, the city should be progressing, and as a whole, like I don't know what he would exactly say then, but and that you by yourself are nothing, like you have a certain job to play.
Yeah.
That you can,
Well, I mean, I think that that's a possibility, okay? The reason why this statement is kind of chilling to some people is because it does, for some people, that's what it means. It means that Socrates is saying that the individuals don't matter. They have formed this unity, this whole. And so now we don't look at the individuals, we look at what they've created, what they make up, and we see if it's working well. And if it's working well, we call this a happy city. But it's chilling because it abstracts enough from the individual, right, that it would seem like perhaps an injustice has taken place, okay? An injustice towards any particular person in the city, particularly in this case the warrior class, because maybe he's just said, your happiness and satisfaction isn't really my primary concern. Your function is my primary concern, and if you're functioning well, then the city as a whole is functioning well. this chilling aspect of Socrates' proceeding, the way he goes along developing this city, is repeated in several other places, where you get the sense that the individual is just sort of melded in or melted into the whole. And this is why some of the people in the video said Socrates is a totalitarian, okay? Because he seems to not care about people. Remember in the intro class we showed the video on the collapse of communism, and that poor sucker in the back row of the stadium, you know, the Ceausescu was looking at, and he was holding up his card the wrong way. He was all scared because he thought maybe Ceausescu would be pissed off because this one, you know, flaw in the big design. Everybody was supposed to create this one big design, and the individuals weren't supposed to matter at all. You know, that's the classic problem of totalitarianism. The individual gets totally disappeared into the mass. And so some people see that in Plato, and this is just a great place to see it, okay? There are other interpretations of this, and one other interpretation is that when Socrates moves into territory like that, he's actually thinking of the metaphor to the individual soul, okay? It's difficult to tell exactly when Socrates moves into that territory. But when he says happy city, as though the city is all one, it could be reminiscent of his reference to the individual soul. What makes the individual soul happy is definitely, you know, each part doing its part well, and each part makes up the whole, the unity of the one individual. Okay? So it could be we could let him off the hook in that way, or we could assume that he means the majority of people, but we'd have to make that assumption because he doesn't say that. You know, he doesn't say, I'm going to, you know, take a poll, and if a certain percentage like this system, then we're good, you know. Instead, he leaves it kind of open, and that's why there's these differences in interpretation, okay? So it does point to, whichever way we go with it, whether it's about the city or the soul when he makes that statement, it does point to the fact that Socrates has a different concept of freedom than you and I typically, I think, okay? For us, what does freedom mean?
Like the freedom to make our own choices.
Mm-hmm. Right, to make our own choices, including our mistakes, right? You know, it's up to us. We can decide if we want to be, you know, very famously in our country, whether we want to be religious or not, and if so, what type of religion we want to be, right? We can be politically active or not, okay? If we're politically active, we can be a member of a number of parties or no party at all. We can decide what kind of lifestyle we're going to live, whether we're going to be single or married, whether we're going to cohabit, or we're going to live the gay lifestyle, okay? There's a variety of choices, and all of them are open to us, okay? Now, Socrates clearly thinks that that number of choices, which exists in a free society such as we define it, leads so many people down paths that are not fruitful for them, okay? That it is not the cause of happiness. That type of freedom is not the cause of happiness. It doesn't make people happy. A lot of times it makes people unhappy, okay? And so, whereas we say, you know, the freedom itself makes me happy. The fact that I have the choice. If I didn't have it, I would be very unhappy because I'd be restricted. I wouldn't feel, you know, free, okay? Socrates always asked, free to do what, okay? And so his concept of freedom is when we are free from our lower self. Remember in the Gorgias, he goes into that big description about the slavery to one's passions and how, you know, a person can be basically caught up in, you know, the power trip or, you know, into whatever it is that they desire, and the desires take over and they don't have free choice, okay? So for him, when you master yourself and are capable of making good choices based on that self-mastery, then you're free. So the way he would look at democracy is most people are not free. They think they're free, but they're actually slaves to their passions. They don't understand the choices that they make. They don't, they're not really truly in charge of their government because their emotions are being manipulated by others. Okay? And so the freedom that they have is an illusion. And we'll get that when he talks about the cave, you know, the analogy of the cave, which we'll get to next week. Okay? But he says there that, you know, most people are like living in darkness. They're in a cave. They think it's the real world, but it's not. They think they're free, but they're not. Okay? Does everybody understand that? That's kind of a hard thing to grasp. But so just because you have your choices doesn't mean that you're truly free if you aren't a master of yourself. And that's why Socrates thinks it is not the worst thing in the world to be guided by another so that you can become as much in control of yourself as you can. Okay? He would agree with Kohlberg that most people can only reach the law-abiding state. But if the laws are good, they're better off than if the laws are bad. Okay? They live the best life they can. And some people within the good state, governed by good people, can achieve that higher level of principled thought and become truly self-governing. So they have the ultimate freedom. Okay? So what some people see as dictatorship, Socrates sees as necessary for allowing people freedom. But the problem, of course, is you have to have, it only would work if you had truly wise people in charge. The practical problem, which he is going to address, is that lots of times you can't find those truly wise people. How do you find them? How do you recognize them? How do you get them in place? Keep them there? You know, because in most actual governments, it's not the truly wise who know what justice is and can morally reason. It's the politically ambitious, right? Okay, so he does realize that. And, you know, you may think, well, what the heck is all this for then? Well, one of the things it's for is being able to realistically look at democracy, to be able to realistically assess democracy, okay? Because for the most part, people in a country such as ours think democracy is the best, okay? It's the best because it makes us free. We're in charge and so forth. It gives us a corrective so that maybe we're a little bit better equipped to be citizens in a democracy if we understand it's not just uncritically the best and we're not just completely free and there's no problems with the fact that we all make all of our decisions for ourselves and get into all kinds of trouble. It gives us a little bit more of a critical perspective, which can be helpful for democratic citizenship. All right, so after discussing that, we see that he begins to discuss the rightly ordered soul as well as the rightly ordered city, and he goes back and forth. So in this section, around 103, 104, 105, you can see him going back and forth between discussing the classes in the city and discussing the parts of the soul. Okay? So in a nutshell, he says the city has wisdom because it has the rulers who will come from the auxiliaries, and we're going to talk about that more in detail in Book 5. And that wisdom corresponds to reason, right reason in the soul. Okay? The city has courage because that's the quality of a well-trained warrior class. Okay? Or it's sometimes translated spiritedness. Okay? The city has spiritedness because of that well-trained warrior class. And in the soul, that becomes the spiritedness or courage or willpower. There's a variety of ways of thinking about that, but that second part of the soul. And then he says the city has moderation, and there he's talking about the fact that the top two classes govern the bottom class. Okay? They have moderation because the rulers make the rules and the soldiers enforce those rules capably, okay? Which means that the masses, the people in that bronze class will have enough discipline to live peaceful lives and to do their jobs, okay? So that corresponds, that lower class corresponds to our passions. And The people, in other words, in the bronze class are our passions in the soul. Okay? And if they're left ungoverned, if they don't have good rules and they don't have good willpower, those passions become a problem. But if they're kept under control in the soul through reason and spiritedness, then they can be very productive. Okay? So, does everybody understand how he goes back and forth here and what the basic analogy is at this point between the city and the soul? Okay. Rulers, soldiers, people, reason, spiritedness, and passion. And they have to, both of them have to be in the proper order with the right people in charge. Okay, everybody doing their part in order for there to be success. All right, so how does he define justice then in the city? This is kind of a summary question. How does he define justice? Remember that it's not, in the conversation he has with those guys in books 1 and 2, he keeps saying that their rules are wrong, that there's some exception to their rules, pointing to a higher standard. Okay? So it's not the rules that the guardians make. That's not what justice is in this city. Because every rule may need to be changed at some point due to some sort of extenuating circumstance. Yes, I did. Okay.
Isn't it like what we were talking about last time, like each person with the different neurologic soul has to be in the right place?
Mm-hmm.
They have
Right.
to all line up with different.
Exactly. It's the order itself, right? It's the fact that the gold are doing their job, they're in the right spot, the silver are doing their job, and they're not meddling with the affairs of the gold, and they're not trying to be in the bronze class, and the bronze doing their part and not trying to interfere with the rulers and the soldiers. Okay? So in the just city, everyone has their role, and they do their role, and they don't interfere with the others. Okay? So, can you imagine injustice in the city then? What would injustice look like?
The silver trying to be the gold.
Mm-hmm. That would be one example. The warriors trying to use their military power to overtake the rulers. Mm-hmm. And that could happen either by direct coup, or it could happen by them just simply trying to exert pressure on the ruling class to have things go their way. Okay? That's a form of corruption, right? And a state of corruption exists as soon as that warrior class or members of it starts thinking, I want things my way. I'm going to try to influence, or I'm going to try to take over in some way the job of the golden class. Okay? Any other examples of injustice you can think of in the city? Well, what about the people? If the people revolt, right? Because they say, well, we're way more people than you, we can take over. That's definitely the situation of injustice. Or even if the people start questioning and, again, trying to influence. Or if the people in the bronze class decide they want to expand the military class and move into it. Okay? They're not qualified. So, injustice happens when there's an imbalance and when people start stepping outside of their roles. And the same thing is true of the soul. And again, this is why it makes more sense if you go back and forth and if you can see the implications for the soul. Because here it's clear, if your passions decide to rule and make your decisions for you, that's corruption. That's in a poor character, you might say. Or even if your spiritedness is out of control, let's say through excessive anger, okay, and it's ruling your actions, then reason is not in charge. And in fact, as you all know, reason can be used by the passions. Basically, it can become the slave of the passions First you think to yourself, this is what I want, and then you use your mind to figure out how to get it, which could mean robbing a bank, okay? You can be a very clever thief, but you're not a just person. Your reason isn't in charge, okay? So this is Socrates' ultimate answer to the guys that he discussed with in those first two books. It's not rules, it's a state of being, okay? A just person, a truly just person, has a good character as defined in this way, and then no matter what situation they encounter, okay, they're going to know what to do. They're going to make the right decision. If they live in a bad government with bad laws, they're going to recognize that they're bad laws, and they're going to act accordingly to try to change them, or leave if necessary, okay? If they encounter a situation that is not in the laws, not in the regulations, they'll still know how to handle it because they will have good sense. They will have a reason at their disposal to be able to navigate those uncharted territories, you might say, okay? So that's why it's not a set of rules. It's a state of character. And what we would call character, what he would call the soul or the psyche. All right, so justice in the individual is having a rightly ordered soul. So I just did that. I did want to discuss this. So I'll put that up there. He gives proof that there's this second part of the soul, the spiritedness. And that's the one I did want to discuss because I think that most people understand reason and passions because we do experience that little battle on a daily basis, right? You know, you're like, oh, I want to sleep, and but I've got to do 2 hours worth of homework, or I really would like to date this girl, but I do have a girlfriend. You get this back and forth going on. Everybody does, okay? But a lot of people are a little dubious about the spirited part between reason and passion. Does it exist? Why does he have it there? He gives proof of it through a little story that just as an example that he gives of Leontius. And this may seem a little odd to you, but anyway. Near 440 he says, but I've heard something relevant to this, and I believe it. Leontius, the son of Aglion, was going up from the Piraeus along the outside of the north wall when he saw some corpses lying at the executioner's feet. He had an appetite to look at them, but at the same time he was disgusted and turned away. For a time he struggled with himself and covered his face, but finally, overpowered by the appetite, he pushed his eyes wide open and rushed towards the corpses, saying, look for yourselves, you evil wretches, take your fill of the beautiful sight. So it was like Leontius struggled with himself and his morbid desire to look at the bodies of naked boys or something like that. And he struggled with himself and he lost. Okay? But in even losing, he was angry with himself for having done it. Okay? And it's that angry with yourself, that sort of, you need to stick with what you know is right, that part of yourself. That's what Socrates is talking about. And he says at the top of 116 to explain it, he says it certainly, actually Glaucon says, it certainly proves that anger sometimes makes war against the appetites as one thing against another. And then Socrates says, besides, don't we often notice in other cases that when appetite forces someone contrary to rational calculations, he reproaches himself and gets angry with him, with that in him that's doing the forcing, so that of the two factions that are fighting a civil war, so to speak, spirit allies itself with reason. But I don't think you can say that you've ever seen spirit, either in yourself or anyone else, ally itself with an appetite to do what reason has decided must not be done. No, by God, I haven't. Okay. So I liken this, what he's talking about, to willpower, but everybody has to figure out how to think about what it is that he's describing. But to me, there's this aspect of the character that I call willpower, that is not either reason or appetite, that sort of helps a person to abide by the decisions that they've made, even in difficult circumstances. even when it's really, really tempting not to. There's that emotional force that helps you to stick with what you know is right. So I don't know how convincing that is, but that's his proof, okay, that there's that third, or I should say that second part of the soul. We definitely understand the second part of the city, right? You've got to have the soldiers. The second part of the soul, he knows, is a little bit harder to detect and a little bit harder to understand.